A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you, our prestigious international audience, for joining us today, and I hope, of course, tomorrow, for our 6th Masterpiece Symposium, Museums, Research and Discovery, which we bring to you in conjunction with Thomas Marks, to whom I and the team extend our deepest thanks. The symposium marks the beginning of this year's journey towards the fair, which I'm very delighted to say will be returning to the Royal Hospital, Chelsea in June, with our preview day on Wednesday, June the 29th, closing on July the 6th. We do, of course, hope you will join us there in person. And between now and then, please do also keep your eyes open on your inboxes for news of our online content programme, a series of talks, short films and live streams, which will be focusing on the theme of discovery and rediscovery, to be launched in the coming weeks. This afternoon, Knowing Collections will focus on museums as sites of discovery, exploring how research within museums can engender a greater understanding of their holdings, and how new forms of collaboration between museums, as well as between museums and the public, stand to bring new information about collections to light. As always at the Masterpiece Symposium, you will be invited to participate in a discussion during the breakout sessions that follow the panels, with the aim of sharing knowledge and ideas, which I really urge you all to do. The conversations are always fascinating and provide a great opportunity to take part in a relaxed and private format. Our very deepest thanks go to our stellar speakers, and I'm very excited about the lively debate that I know will shortly take place. Tom, with my thanks again to you, perhaps I can ask you to introduce our wonderful speakers and to get our 6th Masterpiece Symposium underway.
Yes, thank you very much, Philip, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody who is watching around the world. It's great to have the Masterpiece Symposium going so strongly, having built up over the past 4 or 5 years. This year, the subject is museums, research and discovery. And today we're going to be thinking really about the possibilities for quite long-standing research aims in museum collections, notions of authorship, of technique, materiality, iconography, the wider cultural significance of objects and artworks. But we're going to be thinking about how they fit into the wider imperatives and broader activities of museums today, and how they're best communicated to the public. In tomorrow's symposium session, we'll be thinking about how transparency and information sharing, and indeed new types of collaboration, including using artificial intelligence, might bring fresh trajectories and how research might follow those accordingly. To just give you a sense of the format before I introduce the speakers, we'll have a panel discussion that will last until about 6 o'clock UK time, so about an hour or what's left of it. And we'll then have these small breakout sessions with groups of probably 7 or 8 people in each one that will be assigned randomly. And those, as Philip says, are a great opportunity for all of you to participate in a subject that we suspect and we hope is relevant to all of you in your work. We have a wonderful panel of speakers joining us today. We have Paola D'Agostino, who since 2015 has been the director of the Museo Nazionale del Bargello in Florence, now known as the Musei del Bargello consortium of museums that includes the Medici Chapels and O San Michele. Paola is an expert on Renaissance and Baroque sculpture, and at the Bargello has been leading the way in an extraordinary renovation and exhibition program, including a huge Donatello exhibition that will take place at both the Bargello and Palazzo Strozzi this spring. Helen Jacobsen is executive director of the Attingham Trust, which is an educational charitable trust that organizes professional development for curators and other professionals in this heritage sector. She was formerly senior curator at the Wallace Collection, an expert on 18th century decorative art and collecting history, and has recently led the Reasoner project. She's also involved in the Disney and decorative arts exhibition that comes to the Wallace Collection this spring. Francesca Whitlum-Cooper is the Myojin Nada Associate Curator of Paintings, 1600 to 1800 at the National Gallery in London. Many of you will have seen her wonderful Poussin and the Dance exhibition last autumn through until January this year, but she's also curated terrific shows on Bouailly and Cagnacci at the National Gallery. And Katie Ziglar, who is the director of the Ackland Art Museum at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where she's been the director since 2016. And I hope she's going to bring us a really interesting perspective from an encyclopedic collection that has close ties with a university there in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. Katie was previously a researcher. Katie was previously working at different arts organizations in the States, including the Clark Art Institute, the Smithsonian, and particularly the Freer Sackler galleries, most recently, where she established partnerships through Asia. I'm going to jump straight in now. I've asked all of our speakers to provide 2 or 3 images just to give us an introductory perspective on the topic. So first of all, we have, I hope, Paola, if you could unmute and put your video on, and if we could have the slides. Paola, over to you to tell us why you've selected these images.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Masterpiece team for the invitation. It is a great honor to be speaking this afternoon, and also gives me the opportunity to talk to a wider international audience who has not been able to visit because of all the health emergency, the Musei del Bargello, and the many projects that are ongoing and relate to both safekeeping of the buildings, which means more knowledge of the architectural history and structure, as well as redisplay of collections. So it was hard to choose cases in point because there are many projects taking place in all the 5 buildings. In the end, I decided that it was probably best for this afternoon talk to give you a sense of what we are doing at the Museo Nazionale del Bargello, which is the headquarters, and in terms of redisplay of decorative arts. Everyone knows the Bargello as a major collection of sculpture and the most important collection of decorative Italian Renaissance sculpture worldwide. However, there is a stunning collection of decorative arts, and we have many techniques, wide-ranging works of art, every one in the highest possible rank. When I was appointed as director of the new consortium, the curator in charge of the museum, Ilaria Ciseri, had already started a very important scholarship project, the comprehensive scientific catalog of the Ivory collection. And she curated the catalog, but she also called in the leading scholars in the field. And the catalog was finally published in 2018 with entries by Benedetta Chiesi, Daniel Gabory Chopin, Silvia Armando, Giampaolo Di Stefano, Marta Musi, Francesco Morena, and Fabrizio Paolucci. And it was the first comprehensive entries on a collection that has over 400 works of art. Now, the Ivory Room is also the first room you generally visit when you reach the first floor of the Bargello, and it had been redisplayed in the early 1980s with a very nice and effective display then. After almost 40 years, it was evident that the objects needed new vitrines for safekeeping and to keep the climate control stable, as well as label and panel text written in Italian and English, which was something missing from the room. So the museum got funding out of its own revenue and was able to commission new vitrines. And after 2 years of major works, over 250 ivory pieces were redisplayed, and the curator, Ilaria Cesare, and the other involved in the project. The display was, in terms of design, done by Guicciardini and Magni, and then there was our own architect, Maria Cristina Valenti, who oversaw the whole project. And what we did was to arrange the ivory pieces either by chronological order or by grouping them, but also to give extra room, and in some cases a whole vitrine, to stunning objects. So the flabellum, for instance, which you can probably see here in the second lot of vitrine, got a special vitrine on its own, as well as the chessboard. And now what the major pleasure when I go and walk in the rooms of the Bargello is to see people who stop, look at the objects, enjoy seeing them in proper light with clear information and with a brilliant combination of standard display, right lighting, and good information that help them enjoy not only the collection as a whole, but also each object in its own right. Like what you see here in the forefront, it's a stunning series of late Roman ivory and Byzantine ivory, which are something that most of the world collection envy the Bargello, because they are incredibly rare. So what we tried to do in this case was to use the mine of academic information that was in the catalog to convey a very clear and essential display for the general public, and have very effective and to the point basic information that then the public can sort of like explore more, either in the comprehensive scientific catalog, or we also had a handbook, like a short version that people can consult. And we slowly, but that it's the follow-up of the project, hope to put most of this information online so that we can have also an online catalog. Now, if we can move on the next slide so that I can be clear and straight to the point and leave enough room for the other speakers. This is another important project that was underway during the health emergency, and it's the Chapel of the Magdalene, which is one of the most important rooms in the museums, because it has one of actually the last fresco cycle designed by Giotto and put into place by himself and his workshop. And it also contains the first and the oldest portrait of the renowned poet Dante Alighieri. It's because of this chapel and because of the portrait that the Bargello, as many of you know, escaped the sad fate of being a jail and became the first national museum in Italy. We had already in mind to do some conservation work on the Paradise wall, which is where the portrait is, because we had some humid problems in the wall. And again, during the pandemic, it was the occasion in which, thanks to funds given by the Fondazione Bargello, the Italian foundation which support the museums, the Opificio delle Pietredure, which, as many of you know, it's a leading center of excellence and study and conservation in Italy, had some not only conservation work, but also some research work to establish that the chapel was indeed begun by Giotto and was painted by himself and his workshop, and also the portrait was completed as it was already put forward by 3037. But this major conservation campaign was also the occasion to prepare for an exhibition that was held at the Bargello last spring, called Honorable and Ancient Citizen of Florence, the Bargello and Dante, which was a very unique exhibition co-organized by the Bargello and the University of Florence, in which 3 professors, Luca Zetta, Sonia Chiodo, and Teresa De Robertis, curated a show centered on the first year of reception of Dante and his work in Florence. And there was an interdisciplinary approach because it was a philologist, a paleographer, and an art historian who arranged a selection of works, and we had illuminated manuscripts, documents, tests, panel paintings in dialogue with the frescoes. And somehow through this text, it was possible to enrich the documentation that proves now beyond doubt that that chapel is of pivotal importance for the museum, but also for the story of Dante reception as well as for painting. And it was also the occasion in which we redisplayed our religious metal work again at the end of the show, and again giving it a more coherent display and didactics and panels and labels in English, which had never been done before. The final example before I conclude, of course, I could not miss sculpture. And if I can have the next slide, it's Thomas' request, but I was very happy to comply with it. And there's the stunning bust by Benvenuto Cellini portraying Cosimo de' Medici. And it was a completely accidental, but very welcome discovery or rediscovery, because I'm sure that who of you is living in the United States hopefully had the opportunity to see the magnificent Medici portrait show that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art last year, curated by Keith Christiansen and Carlo Falciani. And they had requested the bust for their own show, which we very happily lent. And it's a piece that we rarely leaves the museum because it's very huge and complicated, and it's one of our treasures, but it was such a momentous exhibition that we lent it. And before leaving, a few weeks before, the conservator who was doing just some maintenance work, Ludovica Nicolai, who is very expert, together with our curator, Ilaria Ciseri again, decided to do some tests on the eyes, and they consulted. Then I was called in and we said, let's go forward. And stunningly, the silver eyes emerged. And it was something that had already been put forward as an hypothesis in 2003 when there was a wonderful exhibition at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, but somehow the conservation there was not, it didn't have the technology to try and do the test with these new materials. So it was left as an hypothesis then, but this last year was possible to unveil the stunning silvery eyes. And somehow what we have been doing to wrap it up as a sort of like synthesis is to bring together academics, conservators, and our own curators to have a constant dialogue and to bring it forward to the public who visit the museum, but also to the public who follow us online in different forms, either by social media, either by sort of like implementing our website. And because of, for the Cosimo de' Medici portraits, I'm grateful to the Friends of the Bargello who had 2 amazing videos. One when the bust was in New York, which was very helpful because none of us could see the show, and when the bus returned home at the Bargello, documenting that phase.
Paola, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see the work that has been happening in these last few years at the Bargello, and I know other things have happened at the other museums under your aegis. You've mentioned some things that I hope we'll be able to come back to. Firstly, the fact of really quite rarefied, detailed, granular research, cataloging, old school research, which has been the catalyst for a redisplay. So that's something we might come back to later. And then secondly, bringing up Cosimo is a really interesting example because of the way that discoveries can be quite inadvertent as well in museum collections. We'll come back to you, but I'm going to go first of all to Francesca, and the next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. So as Tom mentioned in his introduction, I'm an associate curator at the National Gallery, and the last exhibition that I put on was Poussin and the Dance, which we had at the gallery between October last year and January this year. The exhibition was put on very much with the aim of re-engaging the public with our 17th century French collections. I don't think I'll shock anyone by saying 17th century French paintings aren't necessarily the kind of #1 attraction if you're coming to the National Gallery, although we have one of the greatest collections in the world. And it's an exhibition that was a collaboration with the Getty. And in fact, if anyone's in the US or specifically the West Coast, the Getty iteration of the show opens there today and will be on for the next 3 months. But we wanted to work on dance in particular with Poussin, not only because I think the dance pictures slightly shake off that perception so many of us have that Poussin is cold and difficult and overly erudite, when in fact, you know, these early paintings from the 1620s and 30s in Rome show him to be quite the opposite, full of kind of drunken figures flinging themselves around, having a very merry time. But I think one of the reasons the Getty came to us was because we do have some of the great dance pictures in our collection. We've got the Adoration of the Golden Calf, the Bacchanalian Revel Before a Term, the Triumph of Pan. And we also have this, the Triumph of Silenus, which you can see here on the screen before cleaning on the left and then after cleaning on the right. And thinking about Poussin and dance, we sort of had to come back and revisit a question which had plagued the National Gallery for a very long time. So the Triumph of Silenus, the picture you see here, has what I can only call the dubious honor of having been doubted by most, if not all, but mainly most of the great Poussin experts of the great 20th century. At some point or other, with probably the exception of Pierre Rosenberg, everyone's kind of thought, oh, is this Poussin? Is this good enough to be a real autograph Poussin? We know that there are 3 triumphs commissioned by Cardinal Richelieu from Poussin in the mid-1630s, the Triumph of Pan, which is at the gallery as well, the Triumph of Bacchus, which is at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, and then the Silenus. And we know because of 18th century copies that this is the composition. And where the gallery had kind of left this with the publication of Humphrey Wine's scholarly catalogue on the French 17th century paintings in 2001 was that it was probably after Poussin. It was kind of the best copy that we know of this picture. But the occasion of the exhibition was sort of an invitation in a way to look at the Silenus again, you know, 20 years later, what had changed in terms of the technology that we had available, what had changed in terms of the scholarship. And the first step really was a cleaning treatment from my very talented colleague, Haley Tomlinson, which removed, I mean, you can kind of see it here in the images, this very thick, discolored, gunky yellow varnish, and revealed a much higher quality of painting than we'd been able to see before. We were able to see changes even with the naked eye to some of the figures, which, you know, immediately, you know, suggests that you're perhaps not looking at a copy. We then went back with our scientific department to the science. So we already had samples, paint samples of this and the Triumph of Pan, and they were able to deduce that there were very kind of odd idiosyncratic mixtures of pigments in the two that would be really hard to explain if they weren't being produced at the same time by the same person. Kansas City had done this amazing analysis, which told us that our painting and the other 2 triumphs had all been painted on canvas from the same bolt of cloth. So suddenly, in the kind of time that had passed since the publication of the catalogue in 2001, there was this kind of new material available, but also really a question of kind of how to interpret that new material. It sort of, in some ways, it wasn't so much one groundbreaking discovery as a kind of cumulative series of new facts that led us to then kind of have to reassess our opinions, both of this work and of Poussin. You know, there are areas of this painting which are really rough and kind of almost unfinished and not fully worked up. And what does that mean for how we think of Poussin, who we think of as being such a careful, meticulous, highly finished painter? You know, what does it tell us about Poussin's workshop and the fact that actually this is coming at a moment where he's very busy. He's actually probably at this point not that interested in this commission. So it was a kind of whole raft of things. And if I could just have the next slide, just to finish very briefly. In some ways, you know, the reattribution, you know, was made before the exhibition, but you know, on the back of several years of work, both in the conservation studio and the scientific laboratory, and kind of in the library, and you know, in conversations with many colleagues. In some ways, the exhibition was both the kind of prompt for the reattribution and the kind of, I don't know what to call it, not the icing on the cake, but the kind of, it was just really magical to see the three pictures together, because actually in its clean state, hung alongside the two pictures that were made at the same time, the Silenus held its own. You were able to make those comparisons, you know, right in front of you between the areas of quality, the areas that were perhaps slightly less polished. And I think everyone came away feeling that we were absolutely right to have reattributed it. So I will stop there so that we have time for everybody else.
Thanks, Francesca. And again, you've raised really interesting points about the possibilities for collaboration, both within and between institutions, but particularly in terms of information from conservation treatment and analysis, and then also the interpretation of that information and how whose role it is to create that interpretation. And then again, what you've got here in this slide, the validation of the interpretation, as it were. You know, you talked about the prompt for the reattribution, but the sense in which actually this is the performance of the reattribution on the stage that you created at the National Gallery. So again, display is something we ought to talk about more later, in terms of you know, how research is validated through display. Now we're going to move on to Katie, and you have 3 slides, Katie. Katie, are you there?
Yes, hello. Hello, everyone from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and thank you, Tom and the Masterpiece team. It's a real honor to be speaking before this international audience today. I've chosen to talk with you about a novel experiment with the world-famous Peacock Room by James McNeill Whistler. He called it Harmony in Blue and Gold. From 1876 to 77, it is one of the greatest surviving aesthetic interiors and best examples of the Anglo-Japanese style. I want to tell you how it became an aesthetic laboratory at the Smithsonian Institution's Freer Gallery of Art. It's a complex work, if there ever was one, with some 2D, like this beautiful painting here, and many 3D parts, and actually more than one maker, since Thomas Jekyll created the elaborate gilded shelving projecting out from the Spanish leather-covered walls painted over by Whistler. The original owner, British shipping magnate Frederick Leyland, used this shelving for his collection of blue and white porcelains. You've been looking at a rough approximation of how the north end of the room appeared, featuring Whistler's painting of 1865, The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, over the fireplace, surrounded by blue and white porcelain. There is a distinct interaction achieved between the blue of the porcelains and the bluish green and gold painted by Whistler. Some people like or love it, others not. American industrialist Charles Lang Freer was one of those who did not. When Freer bought the room in 1904 and shipped it to his home in Detroit, he put his collection of lesser ceramics, ones with breaks or iridescence of the glaze from all periods, from Syria, Egypt, Iran, Japan, China, and Korea. Quite a melange on the shelves. So if we could have the next slide. Here it is. He disliked and did not own many pieces of blue and white. But when the room was transferred to the Smithsonian and the Freer Gallery opened in 1923, it was shown in Leyland's taste. Freer's few pieces of Kangxi blue and white were placed on the shelves, and thus it remained for decades, almost as you saw it in the last slide, and thus it with fewer ceramics. About a dozen years ago, there was a radical change. Freer curator of American art, Lee Glazer, decided to see if it were possible to find all the pots Freer had put in the room, which, after all, were hidden away in Freer collection storage, and using photographs from 1906 to place them in the exact spots he did. It was no mean task, for there were hundreds of pieces to search out. Most had never been on view in the Freer since they were not in prime shape. The project took over the better part of 2 years, and it was a success in finding and placing the pots. But what of the aesthetic effect, which I show you here? Many more colors adorn Jekyll's Art Nouveau shelves, and together they project a soft rainbow-like effect in Whistler's greenish blue and gold environment. Being in the room suddenly became a totally different experience. Next slide. Now, here is a view of those Freer pots on the opposite wall, surrounding the namesake painting of fighting peacocks in the room, Whistler's Art and Money, or the Story of the Room. In effect, the two presentations of ceramics in the Peacock Room transform it through different chromatic effects. The Freer Gallery now has the ability to toggle between the presentations and to keep what was a stagnant work of art for more than 3/4 of a century fresh and different. Visitors can view the fabulous room in 2 states of its history and with very different aesthetic outcomes. So this is the story of unanticipated results coming from researching a collection in a very different way than concentrating on understanding the style or provenance of individual objects. It's something that could only have been done at the Freer Gallery. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And again, this is something really interesting, that actually research might be practical, might be aesthetic. There might be a type of experimental research that takes place actually in the gallery spaces of museums. I suppose in some way this type of project, if someone was starting it now, they might do it using a VR or some sort of AR experience. We're going to move on to Helen, who is going to talk to us about Riesner.
Absolutely. Tom, thank you very much. And thank you to Masterpiece for asking me along to talk about the Riesner project today. And I think this is in the context of revisiting research. In 1996, Peter Hughes, the former curator of French furniture at the Wallace Collection, published an extraordinary catalogue of the furniture, which was, of its time, really a remarkable piece, and still is, and much of it is still very valid. But I think after, what is a generation, really, 25 years, new approaches, new angles, and of course, new techniques have come to the fore, as many of our previous speakers have mentioned. And the Riesner project really is an amalgamation of that. But it has a slightly different genesis, I think, because unusually, and I think it is unusually, the project started really from the bottom up. And by that, I mean from the object itself. The object is the center of study. So what you see here is a chest of drawers made for Marie Antoinette in 1780. And about 5 years ago, my colleague at the Wallace Collection, Jürgen Huber, who's the senior furniture conservator, was conserving this chest of drawers. And the Wallace Collection has, but some of them are reattributed, had 13 pieces of Riesner in Peter Hughes's catalogue. And when Jürgen started conserving this chest of drawers, he said to me, you know, Helen, this is completely amazing. It is made so brilliantly and it is so clever and the engineering is remarkable. I would really like to study all our Riesner pieces and see if we can learn more about it, if we can get insights into the methods, the materials and the techniques, which is a very different way of approaching furniture from that which was pertaining in the 20th century and even in the 1996 catalogue. And of course, you know, I was thrilled and delighted. We all know Riesner. We know his position as cabinet maker to Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. He's a very famous, if not the most famous, after Boulle, 18th century French cabinet maker. But actually, we didn't know very much about his techniques or his materials. And it seemed like a really exciting opportunity to do that. We were then very lucky because in England, there are two other remarkable collections of Riesner at Waddesdon Manor and at the Royal Collection. And we got together with those two institutions and collaborated on what became the Riesner project. And with them involved, we had over 30 pieces to look at, which many of them royal pieces, which gave us what we considered to be a really good, strong cohort, which would allow us to extrapolate some conclusions, we hoped. But just focusing, if I may, on the materials and techniques, what became apparent very early on is that these pieces of furniture were much more sophisticated, much more complex even than they look to us today. And the first thing is the color. And people may know now and over the past couple of years of these reconstructions of marquetry veneers, of colored veneers. But really, I think our project was important in establishing that and doing this kind of digital work to give people an idea of what the furniture would have looked like in 1780. And it is very, very different. And I think what you see on the left, the chest of drawers as it is now, is so far removed from what Marie Antoinette must have seen when she furnished her cabinet intérieur at Versailles, that it's a different perspective entirely on taste in the 18th century. Nathan, if I may have the next slide, please. So the materials and techniques was one thing. Jürgen took apart, literally, as much as he could, the furniture, which meant undoing the bronzes, dismantling the bronzes, taking the furniture apart. And what's interesting, actually, when you look at this furniture, is that it does come apart. It's almost like the first flat pack furniture. Riesner and his workshop were very keen to make things in different sections. Now, partly that enabled him to make more furniture more quickly, which was a great outcome for us in terms of knowledge for how his workshop operated. But also, of course, it allows for transportation. And this furniture was moved quite regularly. What you're seeing here is a desk also made for Marie Antoinette in 1783. But not only did Riesner deliver it to Marly, the Chateau of Marly, but he also then had to pack it up and move it many times because the Queen asked for it to go to various different places. So all this allows the furniture to be dismantled. And in the process of dismantling the furniture, we documented it. So we documented all the pieces. Jürgen, frankly, measured it all very, very carefully. We have a great Leverhulme fellow who worked with us, Alexander Collins, who helped Jürgen on this particularly and was very important in the digital aspect of the project. But anyway, what we have here, this chest of this secretaire, looks to us now as though it's a beautifully veneered in burr wood, probably yew wood, secretaire with lovely gilt bronze mounts. Actually, when that was delivered to Marie Antoinette, it was totally different. It had a similar sort of lozenge marquetry that you saw on the chest of drawers before. It did not have the gilt bronze mount, the medallion in the center, and would have been very, very different in its appearance. But at some stage, we have found out in the early 19th century, maybe late 18th after the revolution, but up probably till about 1820 in that period, this whole secretaire was reveneered as you see it now, and the medallion on the front was fixed. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, this desk then became to symbolize all that is great about Reasoner and how wonderful his work is and how sophisticated, and the mounts are as good as, if not by, Goutier. All these kind of narratives developed around the Reasoner furniture on display, much of it from the Wallace collection, which was the national collection in the UK of Reasoner furniture. But what our research was able to do through the project is to show that this is not the case. This has changed. And apart from the archival work that we did, which I think is so exciting, it did give us some marvelous insights into how taste has changed over the years, how the context of Reasoner has changed, what even we mean by Reasoner, because what somebody meant in 1870 by Reasoner is not what Marie Antoinette would have meant by Reasoner. So all these things were new outcomes from our project, which had not been looked at before. In fact, I don't think would have interested people that much before. Perhaps the 19th century was too close to the 20th century. So we were quite thrilled with some of the outcomes. What I think was new, entirely new, not only to this project, but to the Wallace collection generally, actually, was the digital aspect of the project. And it was agreed at the very outset that we would try and have some digital content, which would mean that this research was available as a kind of evergreen resource, not just through a book, not through an exhibition, but through this digital microsite. And the Reasoner microsite today is on the Wallace Collection's website. I do urge you all to have a look at it. But it contains a lot of different things, as well as this wonderful high resolution photography, which we can do now. It also has the benefit of videos and isometric drawings. And what these do, what they help to do, is to bring what is actually quite a complicated and perhaps to some eyes a bit anarchy interest in how things were made. It helps bring it alive. And to that end, I'd love it if I could just finish by showing you a very short 1-minute video that we put together about a cylinder desk, a plain mahogany veneered cylinder desk that Reasoner made in 1785.
Thank you very much, Helen. I hope you're going to have some of that animation in the Disney exhibition coming up. One of the things that you raised, which I thought very interesting, is both the importance of traditional manual knowledge of materials, but also the fact that combined with new techniques such as high resolution photography, we can learn new things about objects in collections. I'm going to just leap back. First of all, I want to bring our panelists back, if we can bring their cameras on again. And I want to just sort of take a step back from all of these wonderful case studies, which I think have all given a lot of grounds for thought about the place of research in museums today. And just think about what Helen raised in some sense, which is to the degree to which let me ask Paola, the degree to which each generation of curators might come to collections, and in a sense, it might be their job to return to research that has gone before, to rediscover collections for audiences.
Yes, thank you, Tom. It's something that it's very much felt in the Bargello museums. I'm sure like every other collections, but we have his amazing collection housed in monumental buildings, which are works of art in themselves. And each generation has approached this wonderful frame, but also very difficult to deal with in terms of display of collections. And each curator over time in the different museums, of course, excluding the Medici chapels, because of course, no one would think of changing the new sacristy in terms of the position of tombs, had to deal with this triangle, his own or her own view, the collection itself, and what the public might expect. When I arrived at the Bargello, one of the current line that people would tell me across the board, whether regular visitor, whether they were academics, whether they were visitors of a certain age, was, oh, the Bargello is amazing. I would not change a thing of it. And that was a bit scary because there were not many things, but there were some basic things that we all felt needed to be changed, both from the conservator points of view because of the lighting, the vitrine styles, the filtering of the beautiful natural light, but we needed to put in curtains, technology as well as approach to a public who is not always knowledgeable of Western art. So all of that had to be addressed. And I think what is happening at the Bargello right now, it's very exciting because there is the combination of external scholars or specialists who are contributed to cataloging parts of the collection, as well as curators who are bringing their own fresh eye to the collection and the interaction with the general public. And when it came, for instance, to redisplay the collections, we thought very hard and we decided not to have multimedia things in the galleries. And it was the results of many discussions and many interaction and visits to other collections. Eventually, we will develop apps or QR codes so that you can pop up external content or details, amazing details of the ivories or the portrait of Giotto, but we didn't really want to have other experience rather than the dialogue with the object itself and the building. And this is something that, especially in Italy, with historic buildings, we always have to bear in mind because we have to make sure that the content and the collection are in constant dialogue with the buildings and the frames and Florence, which is itself, in a way, a living masterpiece in terms of architecture.
It's really interesting what you say about so many visitors having a sense that nothing should change. But of course, that probably goes against a curatorial mindset or desire to be able to present new information or refresh information.
Yes, and it also excludes a large share, which is something I'm sure everyone, certainly my fellow panelists, but also the people attending the panel are facing with, and it's young audience. The museums are considered to be good for children, for learned people, for scholars, and for elderly, but there is a huge gap, and we have been working a lot with generation of not only children, but young audience in between, say, 7 and 17, which is the time when people don't visit museums.
Fran, one of the things that is needed for research is the time for people to research, and therefore resources for people who might be working in museums to have the time to turn away from some of the other parts of being a curator in order to work on specific projects. From your experience, I mean, do you have to have a research project in museums today signed off before you start that research, or can you pick up something speculative and might a project grow out of it?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, obviously, I can sort of only really speak. You know, my recent experience is at the gallery, and I think we certainly have both kinds of research project happening. I think you've been very diplomatic in your question asking, because I think the sort of blunter version of that is, well, do things always only come out of exhibitions because, you know, exhibitions are ticketed and that's what's drawing the public in. But again, I think the answer is, you know, happily for us, that we have both kinds of research. You know, the example I gave, the Poussin case study, is very you know, it was clearly kind of prompted by, and as you said, sort of in a way tied up with an exhibition. But, you know, I was thinking earlier of, you know, colleagues who spent years doing amazing kind of conservation treatment and panel work on an altarpiece by Giovanni Martini da Udine. Now, he is, you know, almost an unknown painter. We have one painting of his in the collection. It's not a painting that used to hang on view even after its treatment. It's not a painting that, you know, hangs on view. It's not on view at the moment. But there was no reason to not do that research. You know, that project was still undertaken because of the value of what it was, which is a new understanding of that work, new understanding of panels, you know. So I think the answer has to be that you have to have a kind of, you know, a portfolio of projects in the same way that you have a portfolio of outcomes from, you know, the very, very academic scholarly tome right the way through.
You mentioned exhibitions, and one of the things that, from my experience, obviously from sitting on the other side of receiving marketing from museums around the world, in my previous experience as a magazine editor, is that obviously a lot of the larger museums around the world, and smaller ones too, try to lead with new discoveries, lead with new information. That's the story, and it is a story if you're a journalist. Is there a feeling for you, I mean, not necessarily specifically in the National Gallery because there's so much discovered, but that really an exhibition, in order to be a success to some degree with the public, needs to be able to present something new to the public?
I think that is a really interesting question, and a really, you know, really timely one. And, you know, I won't make it all about the National Gallery, but one thing I would say about our collection is we've got 2,400 paintings. You know, compared to places that have got 2 million things, we've got a kind of finite amount of stuff to work on. And I feel that we're maybe getting to a similar space with exhibitions, not obviously that we've catered to, you know, or covered every conceivable artist or theme or genre, but I think there's an interesting distinction perhaps to be made between new information and new understanding. I don't know that you necessarily need a brand new piece of information to be able to mount a project that shows you an artist in a new light, or that lets people understand things in a different way. You know, funnily enough, the Silenus, we didn't have a huge amount of new information. You know, that canvas weave analysis had been published by Kansas City 10 years ago. You know, we had samples from when they were taken back in the 90s. I think it's about what can you do to facilitate new understanding, and maybe there's a slight distinction there. But I agree, you know, it's easy to kind of hook the marketing on a discovery.
Well, on that note, I think it's interesting to turn to Katie, because Katie, I know that one of the elements of the collection at the Ackland that you've been trying to grow is make acquisitions in the field of Islamic art. And I thought that was interesting. I mean, obviously, a museum has to do due diligence when it makes an acquisition, and that's an opportunity for research in itself. But to some degree, as the director of that institution, you have an opportunity to bring types of art to it that might make it grounds for future research. Is that how you feel when you're growing a collection, Katie?
Absolutely. We had a small collection of Islamic art primarily works on paper paintings, but very few objects. And I felt it was quite important to expand that grouping and show the reach of the Islamic world to China and the East, as well as westward to Italy and Spain through ceramics in particular. So one of our emphases in thinking about objects for acquisition is whether they do tie to another culture. And we recently bought a Quran board from a dealer in London that it's from Ethiopia, but is covered with writing from the Quran, either for practice or for meditation. And it's a beautiful sculptural piece in and of itself in olive wood, but it ties immediately our Islamic collection to our African collection. So that's something that we're very pleased to find and want to do even more of that. And yes, a great deal of research then is to be done in the future on all of these things and various aspects of them, including how they don't all have to be how they tie to other cultures, but that is something we're particularly interested in.
Can I ask you, Katie, because certainly Helen, when she was at the Wallace Collection is recognized in this country as a research organization, the National Gallery is, and I know the Bargello has partnerships with universities that perhaps we can bring up, but you're the one museum that is, I suppose, is actually part of a university here represented today. And to what extent does something like bringing those things in become an opportunity for other faculties to come in and research your collection?
It's tremendous, actually. We teach 10,000 undergraduate, graduate, and professional students at the university each year. We actually call ourselves the largest classroom on campus. And professors from 30 different disciplines use our artistic resources to achieve their teaching objectives with students. So we don't just teach art history students, which of course we do, but we teach many, many other subjects: classics, anthropology, literature, even medicine. We have a wonderful course that we do for first-year medical students called Can We Talk About Race, that uses a work of art by an African American as a jumping off point for a discussion about difficult things, but ultimately about the importance of anti-racism in the practice of medicine in the United States going forward. So there's we are very much entwined with the university and the faculty from so many different dimensions.
I'm aware that quite soon, although not quite yet, Nathan, we will move to breakout sessions because we have limited time. But if anyone would like to ask any questions of our panel directly, they ought to add any questions in the chat box. Let me turn to Helen, though. Helen, I'm really intrigued. I mean, obviously, the Wallace Collection, and you decided to go for this digital microsite for the Reasoner project. You've also published on Reason. Let me ask you the larger question about the different platforms, which is, I mean, in museums today, do you feel like scholarly publishing, the publication of new research, heavily tent-pegged with footnotes all over the place, is still an imperative for museums? You're on mute, Helen.
Thank you. I think the problem here that so many museums face is that of funding. And these big, wonderful collection catalogues, which have been and continue to be used as the point of reference for all sorts of collections, are just very expensive to put together, both in time and curatorial time, but also obviously in financial resources. And I suspect some museums are going for more of a quick fix. You know, we're getting more accessible catalogues, more accessible highlights books. Obviously, exhibition catalogues are another form. I think the whole gamut of what is required of a museum is much bigger than it used to be. You know, children's books or books aimed at a particular audience. So I think it's hard for museums, but I don't think, and I really hope that, well, I just don't think the place for these catalogues can ever disappear, because you know, they're the engine room, if you like, for so much other interpretation that we need it. We need them, and we're just
one of the ways forward may be that. One of the ways forward may be that actually some of the catalogue raisonnés that have appeared online in recent years are, so long as they have editorial boards to them, have the advantage of being able to be updated as things change. And I suppose one of the risks of catalogue publishing is that, although it was a strength in the past, as soon as the catalogue is published, then that's the last word for that point in art history. Fran, I was interested because you published your findings in the Burlington magazine, as well as obviously doing all sorts of media over it.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, you know, in relation to precisely this question, because, you know, I think especially as, you know, museum people and academics, you know, I'm sure we all love the great, you know, scholarly tome, which is, as you say, of its moment, definitive, and you can go and read it in a library. You know, I'm relatively tech savvy, but I'm never going to find it as pleasurable or easy to navigate an online version of that as I am, you know, going and looking at it in the library. But I mean, I think what's been exciting with the Poussin is to think that in some ways this is a kind of an updating of a collection catalogue that came out 20 years ago. But that it has this kind of broad gamut of places that it's been talked about, whether that's in curatorial talks or online things, or even, you know, from the kind of exhibition label. You're quite right. We have the exhibition catalogue. The reattribution went in an article in the Burlington. Actually, the long-term goal for this year is for my colleagues and I to write up the full kind of technical scientific article for our technical bulletin. So that interests me, the idea that, you know, one project has so many different outcomes for different people. You know, I think we can't, you know, it's sort of snobbish to think, oh, well, you know, the catalogue is only for scholars, and, you know.
Well, this brings us back to what Paola was talking about. It's almost like one of the things that you faced coming to the Bargello, Paola, was to some degree the display had lagged behind the necessity for information for even the standard member of the public coming into the museum. And actually, in the Bargello, it sounds like research has been the catalyst for refreshed information, better public-facing service in terms of explaining objects and their cultural value and their history. And I'm really excited to hear that because I guess you've made very clear the historic framework of the building, so there's not that much you can do, and you don't want to interfere with that.
No, because it's unique.
The possibilities of QR codes of apps, so long as they don't distract from the experience of the art, seem perfect for the Bargello.
Yes, and I think also for all the other museums of the group, because in the end, you know, I'm sure we all took part during the terrible pandemic. Oh, what will happen of museums? What is the future of museums? Will people go back to museums? The moment we all reopened doors, visitors came back. No one could ever substitute the beauty or the experience of being in presence with an online content. On the other end, we are all conscious that we read to reach a much broader audience. So what Francesca was saying before, and in a way, Helen as well, the academic research is the core, the curatorial research is the core, the dialogue with the conservator is essential because they bring their own unique aspects, but all of that has to be distributed at different levels. And I completely agree that a comprehensive catalog and the academic research is essential for visitors as well, because they can enjoy as much academic information as a scholars and vice versa. So for us at the Bargello is what we are working on and very hard. And I'm very conscious that it will not be a brief process because the collection is huge and we have every technique, every media, every culture that you can think of. We have it. In the Chapel of the Magdalene, we have an African cross of the 15th century displayed, juxtaposed with the Pollaiolo cross. So, you know, all of that will just continue spark debate among visitors, among scholars, among academics, and among curators, I hope.
I just turn back to Helen quickly before we go to the breakout sessions, because Helen, you mentioned funding, and now from your position at the Attingham Trust, sort of looking across the sector, certainly in the UK, but it's international, of course, the Attingham Trust. I mean, do you get a lot of sense that people feel that they have adequate opportunities for research grants or to apply for them, that there are opportunities out there, or that we're in quite a risky situation in terms of research in museums moving forwards?
I would hesitate to be too optimistic on that, I'm afraid. I think there is concern that funds are tight. I mean, one of the things that has hit many institutions has been the fall in visitor numbers, and therefore income has been slashed in a number of organizations. And some of that income was obviously funding some research and publications. So I think it is going to be a difficult time. There are still wonderful philanthropic organizations and philanthropic people who are happy to give money specifically for research purposes. And I laud them, I really do. They're wonderful. Because we have to keep going. I mean, we're talking about revisiting research. We can only continue to learn from these wonderful objects. And I think it's exciting for people who work with them, but it's also very exciting for the audiences who get more out of the objects the more we know about them. They really do speak to us.
Katie, from the perspective of a university museum in North Carolina, in an area called the Research Triangle, are you able to, can you foresee sort of decent funding for bringing researchers in to work on objects in your collection?
Well, it is a tough area, I have to admit. We are just completing a very scholarly catalog on 134 drawings, unique drawings that were given to us by a family, the Sheldon Peck family, along with, these have 7 Rembrandts, by the way. It's Northern European drawing, Dutch and Flemish of the 18th century and 17th. But they had enough foresight to give us the funding needed to do the research for a major catalog, as well as put on an international exhibition. So it just, circumstances really vary. Sometimes you get the art without funding. That's usually the case, or with a little bit of funding. And other times you can be lucky and get a sufficient amount of funding to do all the things that will bring a collection to life through research. Well,
it's good to have the art in the first place. So on that note, I'm going to thank all of you for this really illuminating panel and the case studies you've brought. We're going to move into breakout rooms in a minute. We'll have about 20 minutes for those. I really urge people to stay for them and have a chance to talk with other people who have been watching, and some of the panelists will be staying. After the breakout session, in which you're invited to continue the conversation, you'll be returned to this main room just to round things off and say goodbye. So Nathan, if you could get the breakout sessions going. Well, I'll just say a few words of thanks to those who have come back from the breakout rooms. We had in our room a really interesting discussion that was starting to think about the access of other people in the art world to institutions for research, whether that's, well, students across other faculties, but also we were talking about the possibilities for people working in the art market to get into archives. We were talking about the opportunities for academics to use museum archives, and the thought that actually museum collections of objects are in themselves open archives, and it's harder to get into print and drawings rooms in some places. We also had a fascinating discussion about the sort of difficulty in museums and the importance within the staff to allow for structured time or research leave, or so for curators who are both public facing on the ground, giving public talks, making exhibitions, but to have the time to do research on the side. Sometimes that needs to be structured into their job description and what's available for them, and what shouldn't happen. There was an interesting example from a historical V&A 30 years ago, really, where it was almost a two-tier system where some people were allowed to research and other people weren't, and that was decided in our group that was not such a good way forward. Anyway, I hope that all of you had excellent sessions in your breakout rooms. We'll have another one tomorrow. I hope that you'll be able to join us again then. Tomorrow from 5 p.m, we're thinking about transparency of information, data sharing, how we can standardize things if we need to across museums, how we can learn from reconciling collections with each other, and it promises to be another fascinating discussion. Philip, I think traditionally you probably give the thank you tomorrow. So on that note, I imagine that all it remains is to say thank you again to our speakers, and thank you to all of you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You. Bye.